research support seminar for this year, and since I became Associate Dean for Research. And the topic today is open access publishing, tips, tricks, and new developments. So we have Zachary Kendal here from the university, scholarly communications consultant, who I heard speak about open access and all the things that are available for us at the moment via the university recently, and it was excellent. So I've dragged him down to the law school. And we've also got Associate Professor Rebecca Nelson down there, who's, after Zachary has spoken, she'll just have a few words to say about her own experiences with open access and using some of these new agreements that the university has at the moment. And there should be plenty of time for questions and discussion. And there's quite a few people online as well. So we'll welcome your questions also. Unfortunately, Jason Odering is unwell from the law library, so he won't be joining us, but Carol Hinchcliffe and other librarians are here if we do have any questions for the law library staff, and of course they're always available to help anyway. So I'll hand over to Zachary.
Thank you. So thanks very much for having me. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, whose unceded lands we meet on today. I'm joining here, of course, from the Parkville campus. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today, I'm going to cover a few things in this presentation. I'm going to start with taking a look at what open access is and why you might choose to pursue it. We'll then have a look at open access publishing with a specific focus on the 2022 open access publishing agreements. These only came into effect in January. A lot of people are still hearing about them, and so we'll talk a bit about what those are and how they work. And then we'll finish with some notes on repository open access, which is a free pathway for paywalled content that allows you to make it available to the public without cost. Feel free, if you're joining online, to ask questions in the chat, or we'll be taking some questions after Rebecca's spoken. And I'll be circulating a extended slide deck at the end as well, for anyone that's interested. So first, why pursue open access? So there are a number of benefits to pursuing open access. You may be familiar with these, so I'll just kind of run through them quickly. Of course, when you're publishing open access, you're publishing out from behind paywalls. So you're removing the financial barriers that are usually there to accessing research. This means that you're reaching a much wider audience and getting a lot more exposure than you would otherwise, because your work will be publicly and freely available. In doing so, you're allowing it to have a much greater potential impact on public policy. This is at government levels, as well as reaching practitioners in your field. So practicing lawyers that may not necessarily have access to scholarly subscriptions, with scholarly journals, will be able to access and put into practice what you're writing about. Another important aspect of open access, I think, is its inclusivity of researchers around the world. One of the things we often find when publishing behind paywall journals is it really excludes a lot of the global south institutions that don't have access to these high-cost databases. Publishing open access means having that global conversation, opening it up. It also means making the research available to the taxpayers that fund it through public universities, through Commonwealth grants and the like. But a point that I'd like to emphasize here is the higher citation rates often associated with open access. We call this the open access citation advantage. And I've got some data on the screen there relating to University of Melbourne outputs from the last 6 years. So as you can see, there's a substantial difference between the average citations there on the left, between open access articles and closed or paywalled articles. The average citation of an open access article being about 24 citations versus just over 14 for closed articles. This advantage also follows through to other kinds of metrics and kind of tracking of engagement. So we can see with the percentage of papers receiving attention, be that in news articles, in social media, in policy documents, that almost 75% of open access articles receive attention, compared to about 58% of closed or paywalled articles. Of course, you may also choose to pursue open access because it's mandated by your funder. The two Commonwealth funders, the two main Commonwealth funders, ARC, Australian Research Council, and NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council, both have open access policies that are broadly similar. Just highlighting the ARC one here. It applies to all research outputs that are funded by ARC grants. It applies to scholarship holders, although preprints and data are exempt. It requires that all research outputs are open access within 12 months of publication. So this can be a real impetus for pursuing open access or paying attention to the embargo period of an accepted manuscript. It can be either the published version or the accepted manuscript made open access in order to be compliant with the policy. And we'll talk more about versions in a bit. When these slides are circulated, you can click on the links that are highlighted on the slides for more information. We also have a principles for open access to research outputs statement at the university, which states our commitment to making research as open as possible. Encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in this area. So let's dive in now to open access publishing. And we'll start by kind of setting the scene for the open access or for the publishing landscape as it exists at the moment. You may well be familiar with this, but it kind of helps get a lay of the land. So on the one hand, we have fully open access journals and publishers, sometimes called gold open access publishers. And they're in contrast to the traditional publishers and subscription journals who kind of dominate the field still. Now, of these subscription and traditional publishers, most are now hybrid publishers, meaning that they will offer open access publishing for a fee. There remain a few fully closed or fully paywalled journals, but they're kind of ever diminishing. So one pathway to open access is through the publishers themselves. We can call this, think of this as publisher open access. And this, when you follow this route, it means that your article or book chapter is immediately published as open access and is usually available under a Creative Commons license. For fully open access journals, this may involve the payment of a fee, although many fully open access journals are funded by societies or organizations. It will always require fees, though, if you're publishing with a hybrid or subscription journal. Where fees are charged, they can sometimes be avoided by making use of an open access publishing agreement that exists between the institution and the publisher. We'll talk about those in a moment. If your article or book chapter does end up behind a paywall, so it isn't published open access, you can almost always pursue repository open access, which is a free pathway, sometimes called green open access. And by following this pathway, you can make your accepted manuscript open access in a repository, such as an institutional repository, usually after an embargo period. That's usually 12 or 24 months. But let's start off by taking a look at publisher open access. So just a note first, if you're looking for a fully open access journal, a great place to start would be the Directory of Open Access Journals. They have good screening to weed out predatory publishers. You can find out a lot about journals in there, and you can search by discipline. They're also very upfront about article processing charges, or APCs, the fees I mentioned. And it's worth noting that about 70% of journals in the directory do not levy APCs. This is true for many law journals as well. It's also worth noting that a lot of other journal lists, such as the Scimago Journal and Country Rank, can be filtered to only show open access journals. So that could be another way to discover open access journals in your field. When it comes to book publishing, there are lots of options. Most academic book publishers will have open access publishing pathways, often with fees involved. There are some fully open access book publishers where everything they publish is open access. Largest of these in Australia would be ANU Press, which I know some in the faculty have published with. Excellent publisher, entirely open access. But if you'd like to get an idea of the other publishers that release work open access, you can take a look in the Directory of Open Access Books. where all manner of content has been made open access, either through the fully open access or hybrid pathways is listed. But let's really dive in now to the open access publishing agreements. So under these new publishing agreements, University of Melbourne authors, who are corresponding authors on the articles that they write, can avoid out-of-pocket article processing charges. Now, all of these agreements that we'll be talking about are detailed on our open access publishing agreements webpage, which is linked here. I believe links have been circulated in newsletters and the like. Can be accessed through our open scholarship website, which is in the process of being revamped as well. So lots of excellent content there. Now, when we're talking about open access publishing agreements, there are three main kinds that are in play at the moment. The first and most common of these is the read and publish agreement. Now, most of our agreements are in that category, so that's what I'll be focusing on today. This is essentially where some open access publishing has been included in the library's kind of subscription to the journal. So, a single institutional cost, which would usually have been the subscription, now extends beyond just reading, like read access to the paywall content. It also includes open access publishing for affiliated authors. We also have publishing agreements with open access journals in play, and that's usually when a institutional membership or supporting membership fee replaces author-facing APCs. We only have one of those at the moment at the university. That's with the humanities publisher Cogitatio. It's something difficult because there's no existing funding sources to really tap into. Publishing in PLOS One, for example, would come from many different sources, schools, faculties, grant funders. So getting all of that money into a pool that can be used to fund agreements with open access publishers can be quite difficult, but it is something we are keen to explore ways of facilitating. The other kind of agreement is more of a model. It's the subscribe to open model. It's worth mentioning because I think it's a kind of exciting development in this space. It's where the publisher sets a subscription or revenue target for the year. And if that's reached by the end of the year, then they will make all of the following year's content open access, which means it will be free to publish in and free for everyone to read as well. This has been trialed with quite a few journals and publishers, and they've found it quite successful. The publisher annual reviews is now extending it to cover their entire portfolio. So this is something also quite interesting that we support through a number of journals and publishers and worth keeping an eye on. But we'll focus now on the read and publish agreements. So here are some of the agreements that we now have in place. Most of them, actually all the ones up here commenced this year. We can divide up our read and publish agreements in a few different ways. And so here we have them divided by scope. Those on the left cover both the hybrid and open access journals from a publisher. So Cambridge, an excellent example, both their subscription journals and their open access journals are covered under the agreement. There are a few exceptions, a few society-owned journals. I think it's 8 journals out of the 400 and something journals aren't covered because they don't have open access publishing pathways, but every other title is covered. Also covers CSIRO, the Royal Society, and some other STEM publishers. A lot of the other agreements are hybrid journals only. This is usually because the subscription fee that we pay for, like Oxford, for example, we're only subscribing to the subscription journals. We're not currently paying for access to the open access journals. So they've been reluctant to include article processing charges in our subscription fee with them, which is reasonable enough. So with those publishers, Oxford, Springer Nature, Wiley, Brill, De Gruyter, hybrid journals are covered, but article processing charges are still levied for fully open access journals. Another way of dividing up the read and publish agreements is by those that are capped and those that are uncapped. Fortunately, most of our agreements are uncapped. So this means that there's an unlimited amount of open access publishing covered by the agreements in the calendar year, or for the term of the agreement. Cambridge again falls into that category, as does Brill, De Gruyter, and a number of other STEM publishers. We have 3 capped agreements. What this means is that only a limited number of articles will be published open access under the agreement in 2020. This includes Oxford, University Press, Springer Nature, and Wiley. If your article is accepted after the cap has been reached, then you'll have two options. The first is to publish behind a paywall, as you usually would with that journal. This won't cost you anything aside from page charges if those are levied. You could then deposit the manuscript in Minerva Access, as I'll discuss later, and you can pursue open access that way. Alternatively, of course, you can pay the article processing charge to make it open access. That would only really be possible if you have a grant to draw from, or you have school funds that are intended for that purpose. But it's not usually something we think you should feel obligated to do because there is that free pathway there. It's also worth noting that the caps extend across the entire consortium in Australia that signed up to these agreements. So these agreements were all negotiated last year by CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians. And so the caps that exist actually exist for all the institutions that signed up. So it's very much on a first served basis. The Oxford and Wiley caps we might reach right toward the end of the year. The Springer Nature cap, we're approaching more quickly. We may be hitting that in September. We'll be announcing when these are hit, and we'll be updating our websites accordingly. When it comes to eligibility for these agreements, as I mentioned, these came into effect on the 1st of January this year. They will cover articles accepted from this date. So even if you submitted last year and are still waiting acceptance, as long as it's accepted after the agreement commenced, before it expires, then that should be covered. When it comes to agreement expiry, we've only signed up concretely for 1 year at this point that we may renew, and other agreements may come into play next year. CAUL is very actively negotiating new agreements with other publishers, but we will be evaluating those at the end of the year based on how these go and the kind of feedback we receive and what budgets allow, of course. It's also worth noting with eligibility, beyond the kind of journal scope that I mentioned, there's often only coverage of certain article types. So usually that's research articles, review articles, like original research like that. Commentary, opinion, book reviews are usually out of scope. So it's always worth checking that kind of fine print. Again, this is all detailed on our open access agreements website. And as I mentioned, eligibility will come down to the corresponding author on the article, or the sole author of the sole author piece, of course. So publishers will check eligibility by viewing the corresponding author's affiliation. They want to see that the primary affiliation is with the University of Melbourne. And they will confirm that by viewing the corresponding author's email address. So the email address that was used upon submission of the article. They'll be looking for that unimelb.edu.au domain. The student.unimelb.edu.au domain is also eligible. Chance for me to point out that this extends to students as well as researchers, academics. If you have submitted under a Gmail account or another account, like a personal account, so long as your primary affiliation is the University of Melbourne, it's usually something we can address. It may not, the eligibility may not be automatically detected by the publisher, but get in contact with us. We'll be able to talk to them or reach out to CAUL, and they'll be able to negotiate that on your behalf. But wherever you can, when submitting to these journals, use your university email. Also worth noting that it's not an automatic, by default, everything will be open access kind of situation. You do have to opt in to open access under the agreements. So usually that will be when you're signing a publishing agreement or author agreement after acceptance of your article, and you'll be choosing to publish open access, and you'll be choosing a Creative Commons license under which to publish. I'll talk about those licenses in a second. For now, just as a bit of an idea of what coverage looks like. So these are the top 10 publishers for journal articles in law, excluding faculty-based publishers. And these are the publishers we currently have covered. What this translates to is out of journal articles published by the school in recent years, almost a third of them would have fallen under the scope of the current agreements. So this is a fair proportion that would now be eligible for free open access through these pathways. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these agreements in great detail. I will be circulating the slides so you can look at it more closely. But for example, with the Cambridge University Press Agreement, as I mentioned, it covers both hybrid and open access journals. A full list of eligible journals is available on our website. That's true of all of these agreements. Again, only specific article types are covered. Eligibility is confirmed with the corresponding author's email and affiliation, as well as their ORCID. It's an uncapped agreement, and the author will retain copyright and has a choice of Creative Commons license. They can choose any of the Creative Commons licenses. In terms of how to use the agreement, very straightforward process. Submit like you usually would through Cambridge Core. On acceptance, the corresponding author completes the form, the publishing agreement form, and they would select Gold Open Access as their publishing model and a Creative Commons license of their choice. Rights Link, which is the Copyright Clearance Center, will then confirm your eligibility based on those criteria mentioned. Spring and Nature, just quickly highlighting this because it's a slightly more complicated one, only covers certain imprints including Springer, Palgrave Macmillan, Addis, but Nature journals, Nature titles are out of scope. It's probably because their article processing fees are very high, currently over 15,000 Australian dollars for an open access article in Nature, which is why it wasn't able to be included under the agreement. Also out of scope are the fully open access imprints like Springer Open and BMC. Again, only specific article types are covered, same author eligibility as the other agreements. It's a consortium level cap in place, as I mentioned, and those may be reached later in the year. And you've got a more limited choice of Creative Commons licenses, either CC BY or CC BY NC, and we'll talk about this in just a second. Again, very similar process of how to use the agreement. Submit as usual, and upon acceptance, when you're completing the form, select open access and choose a license. So I've mentioned selecting Creative Commons licenses a couple of times. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about that now. You may well be familiar with these, but Creative Commons licenses offer a really clear way to share your work with the public. And they make it really clear what readers can and can't do with your work. They're made up of an assemblage of different elements. 4 different elements. There's the attribution element, CC BY. This means that whenever it's shared or used, credit must be given to the creator, to yourselves as authors. The share alike SA element means that any adaptations must be shared under the same license. Non-commercial, as you would suspect, this means only non-commercial uses are permitted. And no derivatives means no adaptations or derivations can be made from that work. So this can be assorted in different ways, and they end up kind of on a spectrum of openness. The most open license that you could get would be CC0 or public domain, which would be kind of signing off any kind of rights over the work. That's not really offered as a publishing option. But the most open of them would be CC BY, Creative Commons Attribution, requiring only attribution of the work when it's shared and used. It's this license, this most open license, that's preferred by ARC and NHMRC and other funding bodies. It's generally the license that's preferred by open access advocates as well. But you may decide that it's better to have that non-commercial clause, or better for you to have that no derivatives clause, and you're usually free to choose that under these agreements. If you'd like to find out more about the Creative Commons licenses, the Creative Commons website is a really useful resource, and our Copyright Office can also answer questions that you have about them. And just before wrapping up talking about publisher open access, I wanted to mention author agreements quickly. You probably don't need a big lecture on how license agreements work, but in general, your author agreement will set out the rights that you're retaining as the author, the rights that you're granting to the publisher, and the rights the publisher is granting to readers. That will be through the Creative Commons license if it's published open access. And of course, these agreements can be exclusive, meaning that you can't then enter agreements with other publishers relating to the work, or they can be limited or non-exclusive licenses, meaning you could choose to take that work to another publisher as well, or do what you want with them, essentially. But what I wanted to highlight here is that if you publish open access under a Creative Commons license with a major publisher, you usually have an exclusive license with that publisher, which means that the Creative Commons license will limit what you can do with your work. Because you'll be signing over exclusively almost all of your rights to the publisher, they then only grant whatever is in the Creative Commons license to readers. If you, for example, choose a non-commercial, no derivatives license, that means you won't be able to use your work for like commercial reasons or make adaptations without, again, negotiating those rights from the publisher. So something worth keeping in mind, because we have had that question come up a few times. But like, oh, but I published open access. Why can't I include this in a book that I'm writing or this other commercial reason? And that will be because those rights are held by the publisher unless they're granted in the open access license. So it's something worth thinking about. Also, if you're not publishing open access, if it's going to be behind a paywall, keep in mind that you can try to negotiate around open access with your publisher, especially if you are being funded by ARC or another funder. If they have open access requirements, you may be able to negotiate around the embargo period required. Some notes to finish on publishing charges. We do offer discounts to a number of publishers. We do offer, we have access to discounts from a number of publishers, including Springer Open. Details of those can be found on our Open Access Publishing Agreements website. At the moment, we don't have central funds for APCs. So if you come to the library asking for funding for open access publishing, there's little we can do. It may be possible to access funds from the school or from grant funders, but in general, repository open access is the preferred pathway. So I'll just take a couple minutes, if I've got that, to detail what this repository open access pathway involves. So this is for when your article or book chapter ends up behind a paywall. It's not really applicable for entire books, but usually a single chapter or your own chapter in an edited collection can be made open access this way. It's always a free pathway, and it involves making your accepted manuscript open access in a repository. Now, our institutional repository is Minerva Access, with which you may be familiar. It contains almost 100,000 records at the moment and sees over a couple million downloads each year. Making your work open access through this repository is compliant with those grant requirements I mentioned, particularly if it's within the 12-month embargo. Making PDFs available through Minerva Access also enables PDF downloads in your Find an Expert profile, making it easier for the public and for other researchers to, find the work that you've written through your profile. It's also fully indexed in Google and Google Scholar. But what I'd like to really emphasize here is that when you deposit a manuscript or any file with the Minerva Access team, the repository team will check and ensure compliance with publisher policies and with copyright law. So they will determine and manage the embargo period. You don't have to worry about that at all. If there's any ambiguity around the publisher policy, they will contact the publisher to clarify. And if they need a different version of the manuscript, they will let you know. I'll send you an email. Now, when it comes to versions, here we have kind of the traditional workflow of a scholarly publication. This applies to articles as well as books and book chapters for the most part. You've got your submitted manuscript, of course, what you send into the editor. This can usually be shared freely on a preprint server. Very, very few publishers are fazed by that. Most publisher policies say that you're free to share the submitted manuscript at any time. Still worth checking, but that can usually be shared quite freely. Not so for the author-accepted manuscript, which has been through peer review, editorial review, and revisions, and perhaps several cycles of these. But it's the author-accepted manuscript, that peer-reviewed manuscript that we would like to see deposited in Minerva Access. That's the version that could be made open access. That's the version needed for compliance with funder policies. Importantly, that's the final manuscript that you produce before it goes off to the publisher for typesetting, copy editing, and the production of a proof. The proof cannot be substituted for the accepted manuscript. We sometimes see that attempted, but we can't we don't have the rights to make that version public. And same with the published paper, unless it's published open access under a Creative Commons license, that can't be shared through Minerva Access. Just to finish, you have 3 options for ways to deposit your work with Minerva Access to make it open access. And you can really choose whichever of these works best for you and your workflows. The first option is to use the ServiceNow form that's linked on the Research Gateway. So you just head to Research Outputs on the Research Gateway, and you'll be able to follow the link there to manage your research outputs, and there's a link to the ServiceNow form. Or you can send an email to the Research Outputs team. They're now just taking direct emails. You can just attach your accepted manuscripts or provide links to the open access locations and provide the publication details for that manuscript. And they will make sure that it's updated in your elements record, and they will send that manuscript off to the Minerva Access team for them to do their checks and all that. The other option is to deposit the manuscript yourself in Elements. Elements, as you may be aware, is our publications management platform. It's a good idea if you would like to get familiar with the platform. It allows you to kind of manage your publications, and those are the publications that will then appear on your Find an Expert profile. And if you go in there and view your research outputs, you'll see a deposit button against any output that doesn't have a deposit already. You can just click on that and upload the accepted manuscript. That brings me to the end of my little bit. If you have any further questions, your first point of contact will probably be the Law Library Liaison team. Their email is up there, law-library@unimelb.edu.au. If they receive any thorny questions about the open access publishing agreements, or if there are any problems with those agreements, they'll get you in contact with us, the scholarly communications team, and the research outputs team. That was the team I just mentioned that manage deposit to Minerva Access. Their details are up here as well. And when these slides circulate, you can follow through the further resources to find out more about open access and open research. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand over now to our next speaker.
I just wanted to start off by explaining a bit about why this has been really important for my work to have research that's open access. So 3 reasons, really all to do with the target audiences of my work, which my work is quite interdisciplinary, and often I'd like it to be read by scientists as well as lawyers. I'd like it to be read by government people, policy practitioners, as well as academics, and I'd like it to be read by international audiences, including in countries where it's less common to have resources to have subscriptions to the kinds of journal databases where we might otherwise publish. And so for me, those categories of people and reaching those categories of people, it's much less likely that I can reach them if I only publish behind paywalls and in law journals. So for those audiences, I really need my work to be Googleable and freely available. So I just have 3 example experiences that dovetail with some of the structures that Zach has put up to share with you. So the first is an open access book that I'm in the process of writing for Cambridge University Press. So I think it has been only relatively recently that CUP has started doing open access books for monographs as distinct from journal articles. It's not part of the current agreement that Melbourne Uni has with CUP, so it doesn't cover books, so you do have to pay for it. It's not cheap, so it costs about £9,000, which sounds like a lot, but then if you think about what it costs to publish open access, if you're paying the full article processing charge for a single journal article, where it could be £2,000 or £3,000, and there's about 10 articles worth in a book, £9,000 sounded okay to me as a processing charge to make the book open access. I wanted to note that it appears that for some publishers that sum of money can be a little bit negotiable. So I started having discussions with Edward Elgar about the same book, and they ended up coming back to me saying, why didn't you choose us? And I said, one of the reasons was that your processing charge was higher than Cambridge University Press's, and they sort of said, you should have told us, we could have talked about it. So it might be that there's a little bit of room to move there. The timing of the payments is something that I wanted to share as well. So the agreement for an open access book with CUP foresees that you would pay the charge about the time that you hand in the manuscript. The money that I had available to pay that open access fee was under a DECRA, which was going to run out significantly before the manuscript would be ready. So I had to negotiate with CUP to be able to pay them the money about a year ahead of time, which I would have thought wouldn't be a huge big deal, but it apparently needed some negotiation. And so ultimately that was possible, and that all happened. A couple of what I thought were surprising observations about the process. So I had an interesting conversation with the editor earlier on, where he was saying that in their experience, open access books increase print sales of books rather than decrease, because their experience had been it's sort of a try before you buy situation where more people will access the book open access, and then if they find they like it, they'll want to buy a print copy to have on their shelf, whereas I had previously assumed if I make it open access no one's going to buy it. Apparently not. In terms of the process from an author's perspective, I had approached Cambridge right from the first email saying I want this book to be open access. So I'm a little bit uncertain about whether the process may have changed, but they have said to me, this is exactly the same process as you would go through if you were publishing a book that was not open access. So same peer reviews of the proposals, apparently same marketing support. So they have said they will give me the same marketing support to make the book publicized as they would if the book would not be open access, which I took comfort from. So that's still in process. Another experience that I had recently is publishing a book publishing a journal article open access with CUP under the Uni Melbourne agreement that started on the 1st of January this year. So this was an article that I submitted to Transnational Environmental Law, which is a CUP title, last year, but only got accepted this year. And so it was covered by the agreement, as Zach mentioned. Their usual open access fees for that article would have been over £2,000. So it's pretty nice to have it covered by that agreement. And the process was exactly as Zach put through on the slide. So it's really only at the very end, at the licensing agreement stage, that you tick, I want this to be open access, and this is the license that I want. The third example that I wanted to give, which is maybe a little bit more controversial, is an open access journal article where in order to publish with that journal, you have to pay, but it's open access. So in my field, there's a journal called Ecology and Society, which is quite well regarded. It's not sort of a predatory journal where you pay to publish because they are trying to sort of fleece people. It's well regarded, and the price of open access publishing is relatively modest. So it's about $900 as opposed to the much greater article publishing charges of some other companies. The reason that I went with that option is that it does have quite a high impact factor. And I do think that I'm seeing that in my field, that impact factor is much higher where articles or the whole journal is open access. It's got a really good reputation as well. And so I just wanted to mention that to maybe question the assumption that I think some people have, that style of publishing is kind of inherently risky from a predatory journal perspective. And finally, just something else that I've done is when I've worked with collaborators where the collaborator's university has an agreement with a publisher or some other kind of agreement where they can get open access fees waived or reduced, it has just been strategic to have them as the corresponding author. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to change the authorship order, but that's kind of another strategic way to think about facilitating open access if your work doesn't get covered by any of these other methods. Yeah, I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Beck. That was really helpful, actually, from the academic's point of view. And thanks, Zach, for that really clear presentation. So we do have a few minutes for questions or anything, that you'd like to feed back as well to the library about what you think we should be doing. Oh, Farah says, I don't have a question, but it's so fantastic that we have these options now. I agree.
So yeah, hopefully there'll be some more available, early next year as well. There's some big negotiations happening. So
Okay,
just
so
hope that
hopefully
expands.
more happening,
Mhm.
and because these are only for 1 year as well at the moment, aren't they?
Yes, well, we've only locked in for 1 year. Some of the agreements are 3 years, but if they have an opt-out clause, and so we'll be evaluating our standing with them at the end of the year. But we're hoping that these are, longer term opportunities. Yeah.
Great. Julian has a question.
Yeah, just simple one. I think I might know the answer to this, but I'd love to double check it. If you are actually applying for external grant funding to ARC or someone like that, can you include open access fees within that grant application? Will the funder include that? Do we know?
Yes, I can.
Yes, Maz says yes, you can, and she is the font of all knowledge.
Right. Okay, that's great. It's a good one to know as another alternative.
But I did always, and I mean, as Zach said, I thought, as a university, we don't exactly encourage paying these fees, but of course it's not against the rules either.
Yeah, my understanding, but please correct me, those that are have more experience with the grants than I, is that like ARC and HMRC aren't particularly excited about paying high article processing charges for hybrid publishers. They're much more likely to be on board with like fully open access publishers. It's kind of the,
Okay.
Plan S in the US, in the US and the UK, mostly international agreement, whereby different funders like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, Wellcome Trust are requiring full and immediate open access for funded research. They will, part of the Plan S initiative is that they will pay all article processing charges, so long as it's either a fully open access publisher or a hybrid publisher that's transitioning to open access. And that could be through the read and publish agreements that I mentioned. They can be transformative agreements if they're temporary in the interest of transitioning to a fully open access model. But yeah, so with a lot of funders, there is a reluctance to pay really expensive APCs to for-profit hybrid publishers. But yeah, what's been your experience with?
So I'm aware of that sentiment in a really vague sense, but I've never really heard anyone specifically say it or seen it written down. I also think maybe it's there's a bit of a grey area. So for example, the journal that I mentioned, Ecology and Society, so you have to pay to be published in the journal, and when you do, it's open access, but it's a not-for-profit. And they use the charges to subsidize authors from developing countries. So I assume that there are some areas in which that's maybe less less controversial.
Well, definitely. That's the kind of thing that any of the funders would be fully on board with. I've got a lot of time for that kind of publishing model.
Yeah, that's sort of consistent with what you were saying, that they're fully open access, but and a more modest fee. There are a couple of other questions here in the chat. So Michelle asks, if you use Minerva, is it also worth adding your manuscript to other open access repositories like SSRN?
Yeah, you certainly can. But although I would double check the publisher policy beforehand. We find SSRN tricky because it's not a non-commercial, it's not entirely a non-commercial repository because it is owned, I think, by Elsevier. Is that right?
It is now, yeah.
It is now. So like some publishers have said that they're happy for it to be considered for all intents and purposes like a non-commercial repository. They're happy for manuscripts to go in there. We also had that question arise with like a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial open access article. Because of that non-commercial clause, would you be able to put that into SSRN? And that ended up being something that the person would have to follow up with the publisher to check if, because some publishers have explicitly said, yes, we're happy for it to go there. but like by default, technically it's a commercial platform. So just best to double check your publisher agreement, and maybe ask your publisher if they're happy with it for it to go on SSRM. If it's a non-commercial platform, that's fine. But do double check. It'll be in your author agreements. It will be on the publisher or journal website. It'll also be in the Sherpa Romeo database, which is a database of publisher policies. And it can be easy to see in that database when you look up a journal, where you can deposit different versions and what the embargo periods are for each. One thing I will note is that not many publishers will allow any version on ResearchGate or academia.edu because these are explicitly like commercial networking platforms. Some do allow a manuscript to be put up, but we find a lot of major publishers are very against that. So they will be happy for it to go into Minerva Access, for example, but not for it to go onto ResearchGate. So again, worth checking your publisher policies.
As you can hear, Zach really is the font of all knowledge.
Although I will say, only because I did this morning, because somebody requested a paper I'd written, an article I'd written through ResearchGate. So I did upload a file and it was like the first page, but like on that, it's just the first page of the PDF, but like with a huge link to the Minerva Access repository. For the full text, go here. So they can still access that single page of the document through ResearchGate. Then they would just click through to where it's legally allowed.
Yeah, ResearchGate's pretty annoying. Matthew has a question.
Oh, I don't want to get in.
Okay, well, I'll just comment. So Rosemary has put in the comment that she thinks her DECRA funding was cut to explicitly say that the open access payments weren't allowed. And I know the ARC does do that sort of thing sometimes. So it's possible. Another comment from Brendan, that it would be great if these agreements could be expanded retrospectively in the future, which would be great. Thanks, Brendan. And there's a question from Yan Wang. Can a PhD student publish 1 or 2 chapters of his PhD dissertation and still put them in your thesis? And yes, you will need to acknowledge what publications have come out of your thesis when you submit your thesis, and you can discuss that with your supervisor. Any other comment?
Yes, just that a couple times a semester, usually we run a researcher at library series of webinars through the library. There's a recurring one that I run, open access in your thesis. That might be of interest. We do talk a little bit in there about like thesis with publications, but also, publishing parts of your thesis after you've submitted. And yeah, generally no problem.
Yeah. Matthew, your turn.
Thanks, Christine. So, and Zachary, thank you, Becca. I think Brendan's asked my question actually. Am I guessing that the answer about retrospectivity, going back in time, is we might think about whether it's a priority, but we've got our hands full at the moment?
No, it hasn't. We haven't. That hasn't come up in negotiations. There's a point that Call is negotiating. Some publishers are happy to lower their fees for making something open access if it's a bit older. But
it's actually linked to my comment suggestion, and sorry if you, Carol, and other library people, you know how our graduates are often saying, one of the worst things about no longer being a student here is I haven't got access to all these wonderful things.
Absolutely.
And of course, we do our best to provide some things. I wonder whether talking up what the university and other universities have been doing to try and secure open access might be a way of answering those queries as well, which I think are very reasonable. In other words, if we talk up our open access availability of many of the things we've published anyway, that's a way of saying, well, yes, we are listening to our alumni as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's also something I've been doing a little work and talking about open educational resources like open textbooks and the like. Also, mostly we're now using ebooks, electronic textbooks, right? But unlike when you used to buy a textbook and it would stay on your shelf after you graduated, now with most people accessing through like library subscriptions, they lose access to that, essential textbook as soon as they're graduated. So then they either have to go and buy it, take out a subscription, or, so using open access textbooks, using open access resources can be a way of, meaning that graduates retain access to that information after graduating. And you're very much the same for research. Yeah, making it available to graduates no matter what, once they're professionals or, any.
I think we probably should close up. Now there was Rosemary seconding that it's definitely worthwhile negotiating with the publisher, and there was a question there from Susan, I think, about whether one can spend money on from ARC funds on open access publishing if it wasn't in the budget, which I'll direct you to the research office to figure out whether that's possible or not. But I just want to thank Zachary for coming down and sharing his knowledge. And obviously, if you have other questions, he's a font of knowledge, and as our marvelous library staff here, and Beck for sharing her experiences. And I know, I've received the message loud and clear from our research committee that universities getting together and using their bargaining power to try and force more open access is something we all want to see happen. So really glad to see this this initiative happening and encourage people to use it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should have said, and we will distribute those slides and make them available via the law school intranet, and we have also recorded the session, so that will be available as well.